Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this meeting, how GCSE French writing controlled assessments are marked. I hope you can all hear me and you haven't got any technical problems such as have just been outlined. Let me say just a quick word about myself. I'm the principal examiner for French GCSE writing and have been since 1994. So I've got a lot of experience in this particular paper. I've also been a modern languages teacher. I retired from a career last year. I retired from a career in Essex Comprehensive Schools, and I finished at Clacton Coastal Academy, which you may or may not know. And just a few words now about the objectives of today's meeting. It's very much to do with marking online, marking controlled assessments, and that's all. But hopefully, by giving you some examples, I'm talking them through and answering your questions, you'll be able to come away at the end of the session with a much greater understanding about how the assessments are marked by Edexcel. So as you can see from the PowerPoint, by the end of the session you will be able to do those things. I don't need to read them to you. You can see that we're not just looking at the assessment criteria, although that's the main focus of the session. We're also going to look at writing assessment tasks, which is a pretty important part of the process, as you know. So that's what the session's going to be about. Just one or two things that it won't be about. There will be certain questions that I can't necessarily answer. If you ask me about the other skills, speaking, listening, reading, that isn't really on our agenda, so I won't necessarily be able to answer those. I certainly can't answer questions about your own centres or your own candidates. There are other channels, as I'm sure you're aware, for dealing with that kind of thing. I have got an email address for you to use, which is teachinglanguages@pearson.com. So if you do end the session and there are still some questions that you really could do with an answer, then please try that. I'll say it again, it's teachinglanguages@pearson.com. Okay, we've got a number of activities for you to do, and if I could ask for the first activity 1A to come up, that would be good. Okay, so what you should have in front of you is a script and some boxes which contain, if you look at them, you can see that they contain various comments from the mark scheme. But before I go through those in detail, I just want to say a few things about what examiners look for when they first look at a script, because it's important that you understand how this works. One of the important things to look at is the task type, because as you know, although Edexcel do set a lot of exemplars which centres can use, it's quite possible for you as a centre to devise your own tasks for this. And so markers do get a whole variety of task types. Generally speaking, the task consists of a title and bullet points, but it doesn't have to. The task could simply be a title, and some centres go down that road. It's not recommended for various reasons. It's very often quite helpful to the candidates to have some guidance as to what direction they need to be going in, and so for example it's good to point them in the direction of let's say writing, giving descriptions, giving opinions, using a variety of tenses, this kind of thing. One thing that has caused a bit of concern, certainly in the first couple of sessions of this specification, is to do with how you phrase the rubric of the task type, because this does have an effect on the marking. If you have bullet points that say you must include the following bullet points, then that's not really advisable, because that means that when you look at the mark scheme, you'll see that there, in that first box, for example, where it says relevant response, it talks about omissions. Okay, well, if you've got a stimulus that says you must include X, Y, and Z, then potentially the candidate could miss out one or more of those and be hit by the mention of omissions. So it's recommended that that tasks are set which say you could include the following points. So that way, the marker is not looking out for omissions, because they're purely voluntary bullet points. So that's task types. That's one thing I wanted to mention at the start. Another important point is to do with the length of the task. Now, you will know from the specification the minimum length of a task is 100 words. And if you want to get a grade C or above, then the requirement is 200 words or more. Now, I have to tell you that the examiners don't actually count all the words of every single script that they read. What they do if there's a question of doubt, is that they might estimate the number of words. They might, by sort of averaging out how many words on each line. But it's not part of their job to count the number of words of every candidate. So, in other words, there's a bit of flexibility here. So, in practical terms, what this means is that in order to get a C or above, we're talking about a minimum of 180 words, rather than exactly 200 plus. And again, the minimum of 100 can be a bit flexible, and in fact we've got an example later on where the examiners have been flexible with it. That's the length. The other issue which I would mention is to do with CA4 forms. There's one sort of poking out on your screen at the moment for the first task, and the CA4 form is a kind of aide-memoire for the students, which they can use if they want to, but they certainly don't have to. The rules are that they can write 30 words, up to 30 words, and they can draw up to 5 pictures, small pictures, if they wish. And a lot of students do this, but probably just as many don't use one. Now, the words they're allowed to write, as I say, there's a maximum of 30. They can use conjugated verbs if they want. That's okay. The definition of a word, by the way, is something that's got a space on either side of it. So, il y a is 3 words, whereas c'est is just 1 word. It may seem a bit random, but actually it's quite a practical way of defining what a word is, and everyone can understand it, examiners and students and everyone. If the CA4 form is misused in any way, for example, they write far more than 30 words, then clearly the examiners have to take that into account. But in my experience, it's very rarely misused. It's usually used, if it's used at all, then it's used properly. Okay, I think that's all I need to say before we look at these little boxes. What I'm going to ask you to do in a moment, I'm going to release the screen so that you can actually read through this activity. And what I'd like you to do is to vote on the 3 communication and content boxes that you've got in front of you. So I want you to consider the relevance of this response, and if you know the mark scheme well, you will know that those descriptors in the boxes come from, they're just quotations from the mark scheme. So is it detailed and fully relevant? Is it detailed with minor omissions? So you'll have to see, does the stimulus say you must include the following, or just you could include the following? And so on, right down to the bottom one, little relevant info. So what I'd like you to do is, in a moment, to read through that, and to read through the task, and to place a vote in that box. Do the same for narration, and you can see here the crucial things are description, opinion, expansion. When it says beyond a minimal response, then we're looking at the length of the task. So if it's beyond minimum, then it's sort of 100 plus words. And the final one, the question of ambiguity and coherence, is a pretty crucial thing. By ambiguity, we mean really the amount of hesitation that you have in fathoming out meaning. It's quite interesting how this works, because a word which is misspelt isn't necessarily ambiguous, but a word which is spelt perhaps a little bit wrong can be quite ambiguous. And this is absolutely crucial with verbs, where, for example, a misplaced accent can make all the difference between tenses, and or perhaps some other small mistake might make a big difference in the amount of hesitation or the amount of ambiguity. So what we're looking at for the top category is no ambiguity at all. So that's that means that you can read the whole thing through and there's no hesitation. You know what it's about. The next one down, where it's generally coherent, there might be a few lapses, but they don't really make you hesitate too much. Whereas further down still, some lapses and ambiguity, comprehensible overall. So you've got a generally good picture of what it's all about. Fourth box, just about comprehensible overall. I think it speaks for itself, but you have to struggle a little bit to understand what that is about. Okay, I think we're in business. I think if we can release the task now. And then I'll leave you for a few minutes to read it through and to make your votes. Don't forget, if you've got any questions, just put them in the box and I'll try and deal with them as the meeting proceeds. Ladies and gentlemen, if we can have about another minute for you to complete your voting, and then I'll go through your responses with you. Okay, if I could ask you to conclude that little exercise. I've had a question which is to do with the definition of the word narration of events. Narration, I think, applies to those tasks where in effect there's a story to be told, for example a day out or a holiday or something like that. This particular task, the Bristol brochure, doesn't necessarily have that. But as you'll appreciate, the marketing's got to cater for all sorts of tasks, all sorts of possibilities. So narration is just one strand which is mentioned, and I don't think it's particularly relevant to the task that we're looking at the moment, but it may well do in one of the future ones. Okay, so we are looking at the relevance of this, and I see that most people think that it's detailed with possibly minor omissions, although there's a pretty substantial vote for relevant info but some omission or irrelevance. If we can have a look at the task, there it is. What did the candidate have to do? The brochure could include the following. So, in other words, the candidate had a choice about this. A description of the description of the city, what there is to see and do. And it doesn't say how the candidate should organise the task. And this particular candidate has organised it into paragraphs, but it sort of jumps from the description into these comments about the city from various presumably visitors from abroad. So, although it's relevant, there are other issues to consider, and perhaps further down under ambiguity and coherence they will be considered there. Okay, now the narration, most people there have gone for evidence of description, opinion and expansion. And it's certainly beyond a minimal response, and it's beginning to express opinions. That's absolutely right. It's beyond a minimum in the sense that there's more than 100 words, and the opinions are there, likes and dislikes and this kind of thing. So I think that's fairly clear, and most people seem to be agreeing on that, as you can see. The ambiguity and coherence, overall it's comprehensible, and most people have polled for that one. But there are some quite clear ambiguities. For example, there are bits of English, or anglicisms anyway, like c'est un pittoresque car le docks doesn't mean a lot. Le métro est d'habitude assez agréable, or is it le météo? Difficult to tell, but either way it doesn't make a lot of sense. The thing about 40,000 étudiants is pretty ambiguous. There are other examples further down. This little bit here, on dit souvent qui Bristol était soit trop dangereux. It sort of implies that something else needs to be coming along, but it doesn't. So it lacks coherence there. So some lapses, ambiguity, comprehensible overall, seems to be the right thing. Now, I've had a comment from one participant who says, I thought it was meant to be a brochure and the work does not seem like one. And I think that's a fair point. I think the advice that we tend to give with regard to setting tasks is that brochures actually have got issues. I think in the old days when we used to do coursework, brochures were quite popular, especially for weaker candidates, because they could do lots of small things that weren't particularly linked. But with this particular specification, what we're looking for, particularly under the general heading of communication and content, is items that can be linked, and the candidates need to show the ability to link, even from the mark 7 upwards. It says some attempt at linking piece into the whole. And I think where this particular candidate falls down somewhat is the lack of linking. The fact that, as I mentioned earlier, we suddenly jump from one thing to the other. And there's no introduction for these characters. If you didn't know what the stimulus was, if you didn't know what the task was, you wouldn't know why Amélie from Lyon was suddenly put into the equation. So it's true. It's not. It depends what you mean by a brochure. I think even a brochure can have it could be in sections, but it could be one longer, more structured piece, which is what would get the candidate a better mark, to be honest, rather than lots of little bits which aren't all that well linked. Now, when it comes to awarding a mark, we haven't got the mark scheme in front of us yet, although that will come up in, I think, the third activity we're going to do. But the thing is that those three boxes that we've been looking at and the three votes that we've been coming to, they all have to be combined into just a single mark. So the examiner is looking for a number of things and weighing them up all together. And it's what's known as the best fit procedure. In other words, look at which box in the marks grid seems to convey the overall flavour of this piece of work, and then within that, where does it sit? Well, this piece of work was actually awarded 8 marks out of 15 for communication and content. So it sits quite in the middle of that middle box. And I think the reasons are the ones that I've already mentioned: the general structure of it, the lack of linking, and the amount of ambiguity as well are the sort of negative features. But on the other hand, there is evidence of description, opinion, and it certainly contains a lot of relevant material, so that's why it got 8 more than 7. Okay, I've had another comment, which is to do with the phrase "some lapses." Yes, the question is approximately what amount of lapses does this refer to? Well, that's a very good question. It's a question of a judgment that you can't say that there's a numerical figure can be attached to these things, because the lapses are of different degrees of a problem, if you like. Some lapses are only little ones and some are larger, so it's very difficult to enumerate. So what the examiner is doing is weighing up a number of things together and, as I say, trying to get a best fit. So I'm sorry if that doesn't answer it as a number, but you'll see that lapses are an important feature of the mark scheme, but they're not the only thing that the examiner is taking account of. The next comment I've received about this script is that the candidate is writing in the first person, which is a bit unusual for a brochure. And again, that's a fair point, but it doesn't say how the brochure should be set out. I suppose you could say it's legitimate, it's relevant, because it's offering opinions about the city, and a description of Bristol could easily be a description of Bristol from a personal point of view. So I think certainly at this level, GCSE level, I think we can be fairly easy about the fact that it's in the first person. Okay, now then, thank you for those questions, and I hope that's been helpful. What we're going to do now is keep with the same script, but if we can move on to task 1B, please. We're going to look at the knowledge and application language and the accuracy marks. Now, I think I'll just say a few words before we actually get on to voting. The knowledge and application of language is to do with one of the crucial things is this phrase to do with complex and ambitious structures, and in fact our second activity in a few minutes' time is going to be dealing with those. But that's one thing that it needs to be looked at for. Is the language fairly basic, in which case it's going to be the third category or lower, or are there attempts at more complex language? And the basic language for that middle box, well, that could include things like subordination, which in French could be pretty easily done. Things like parce que, phrases and so on could count as subordination. Tenses, adjectives, and so on. Okay, as for accuracy, I would just point out something about the accuracy box. It's perhaps not clear from this, from what's in front of you, because you've only got a kind of summary of what the category says. But the one that says fairly accurate and straightforward language, and then the one above says generally accurate. Well, in the actual mark scheme, it says generally accurate, but it says when more complex structures are attempted, accuracy can be more variable. When more complex structures are attempted. Now that implies that they have used more complex structures. So in other words, the accuracy mark is kind of tied to the knowledge and application of language mark. If you haven't used more complex structures, you can't get a higher mark for accuracy than that third category down. So in a sense that makes it fairly this makes this one fairly easy to mark for accuracy, because it's kind of capped at that level. Anyway, I will release the task again and ask you to have a look and vote on those two categories now. Off you go. Okay, if I could ask you to finish off that little task, and I'll just talk through what was actually awarded to this candidate. Now, in terms of knowledge and application of language, now, again, we're looking for a best fit here, so you will never get someone who exclusively uses vocabulary and structures from the specification, obviously. So, looking at this particular script, you can see that most of the language is basic. The vocabulary, for example, is mostly from the minimum core vocabulary, which is listed in the specification. There isn't much that is outside that list. In terms of structures, yeah, there are one or two beginnings, let's say, of more ambitious structures. There's that phrase, pour ceux qui aiment le sport, for example, which is a pretty good one, using a pronoun. But on the whole, we're with a mostly quite basic language. And although there's a variety of tenses, there's a fair bit of quite simple stuff. And this is one of the dangers, actually, of a description of a town, in that one tends to get a lot of il y a or il n'y a pas, or on peut or on ne peut pas, this kind of thing. So it's partly the nature of the task, I suppose, that the language sometimes can be fairly basic. So the mark excuse me for that hesitation. Right, the mark which was actually awarded for knowledge and application of language was 5, because it or the control of the language, the variety of the language, wasn't that convincing, but it was relevant. There was relevant vocabulary and so on, but quite standard for the topic. So the final mark, accuracy, and I kind of gave you a big clue as to what the mark was for that, and most people have gone for fairly accurate in straightforward language. That's it. So the mark of 3 for accuracy there. Some of you have considered that there are basic errors that impede communication, and that is a fair point. There are basic errors that impede communication, but the majority of the work, you know, over 50% of the spellings are correct. And so that is definitely capable of being awarded 3. Now then, overall then, just to recap, we've given this particular script 8 for communication and content, 5 for knowledge and application of language, 3 for accuracy. So that makes a total of 16. And you will know from the grade boundaries that if this candidate were to do 2 pieces of work at the same mark, that would be 32 out of 60, which is just less than a grade C. So what I would perhaps ask is if we can just go back to the PowerPoint, please, because I think we have a slide with the grade boundaries on it. There they are. So that candidate, as you can see, would have narrowly missed a C with if the candidate had done 2 pieces of work at the same mark. Now, I think that brings us to the end of that first activity, and thank you for participating. I hope you found that a useful start. It's what I'd like to do now is have a think about the those particular issues of complex and ambitious language, and that brings us on to the activity number 2, please. Excellent. Okay, now I think, if I'm not mistaken, you're going to get a chat box that enables you to suggest yes, what you think complex and ambitious structures are. So, I mean, what I'd like you to do is, yes, just to just throw a few into the pot. Write down what you think an example of a complex or ambitious structure is. That's it. Après avoir is a really good start. So if you could just put some down, that'd be really good. Thanks. Okay, well, thanks very much for that. That's a brilliant list. Thank you so much. That's very good, because all those things are definitely complex structures, and if we see them, we will be pleased to award marks for that. The thing I'd like to emphasise, though, is that we're looking for a range of more complex vocabulary. So in other words, it's not just enough for a candidate to put in an après avoir or whatever. It needs to be rather more than that. I think in the actual mark scheme, as we'll see in a moment, it does refer to a range of these things. Yes, quite a wide range of vocabulary and structures, or a wide range of vocabulary and structures. So it's not just a question of, you know, learning a couple of little phrases and putting them in willy-nilly. It's a question of being fairly on top of these more complex structures and using them to a greater extent. On the screen, you should have the list which is from the specification, and this is the higher tier grammar list. Now you can read it as well as I, but you can see there are 1 or 2 things there which we didn't mention in your list. Comparatives and superlatives. Pronouns are definitely complex in French, and the tenses. Interesting that the subjunctive is mentioned, because we don't expect you to teach the subjunctive. That's not part of the GCSE. It's there to be recognised. That's what the R means. But clearly, if a candidate in a GCSE controlled assessment uses subjunctive, that's great, and you know, I'm all in favour. That's pretty good. They certainly need to be credited for that. On the other hand, when it comes to assessing their, you know, the accuracy of such things, if they do use the subjunctive and perhaps don't get it quite right, then we really can't penalise them for that, because it's not really on the syllabus. So it's, you know, we don't want to be too hard on them when they're trying to use more complex structures which are perhaps a little bit beyond them. Okay, now I think that's all we need to say about activity 2, because we're now going to look at some more scripts, and unless you've got any questions, actually the questions have sort of disappeared from my screen, so I don't know if you're sending me questions or not. Ah, there we are. Right. Yes, there is a question. Right. The question is, can we have a copy of your electronic breakdown of grade criteria? I'm not sure what that means. By grade criteria, I wonder if you mean the grade descriptors. In other words, what a description of a C and an F and an A are. That's in the specification, which I haven't got here. Or do you mean the marking criteria? If so, then that should be on your screen now. At the bottom, where there's a little grid that says, it says student name and task, but actually that is the mark grid. I think what I'd like you to do is to have a look in just a moment at this task. I'll try not to say too much about it before we start, but what I'd like you to do essentially is to read through the task, and this time, instead of going for little aspects of the mark scheme, I want you to look at the whole mark scheme and try and give an actual mark in those three categories: communication and content, knowledge and application of language, and accuracy. So again, you've got the voting boxes there to be able to put in what you think the mark is. And I think what I'll do now, if I'm just hesitating while I just check my... that's fine. So it looks as though, yes, what's on the screen is what is required, the criteria. Excellent. Good. Okay, let's get on with the task then. I'll give you a few minutes to have a look at the task and award it marks in those three categories. I can see most people have voted on communication and content, but there are a few who haven't voted for the other two categories. So perhaps if I could ask you to do that over the next couple of minutes, and then we'll move on. Thank you. Okay, well I think we need to move on now, so I'm sorry if I've rushed you here a little bit, but perhaps you can be considering your final marks as I talk through the marks that were actually awarded. Okay, so the communication content mark, that's quite interesting because we seem to have votes for every mark between 7 and 13, so that's a pretty wide range, isn't it? And starting at the top, a mark of 13 for communication and content, that would imply not just a very detailed response, but that there was no ambiguity at all in the candidate's writing. I don't think that's really true. I think there is a bit of ambiguity, and that's perhaps where the tenses aren't quite clear. There's a phrase in the mark grid which I think every teacher knows what it means, but it's quite hard to define, and that is coherent and pleasant to read. In fact, I've been in a number of meetings with my colleagues from Spanish and German, and we've tried to tease out another formulation for pleasant to read. And so I'll just share that with you and see if you find this useful. This means that pleasant to read means that the candidate is comfortable with the language or at ease with it. And it also means that the candidate has conveyed their own thoughts with fluency. So maybe that helps you to define that very top category. And I think you'll probably agree that this particular piece of work here that we're looking at now doesn't quite reach that. Now, looking a bit lower down, let's see. It's certainly a full-length piece of work, isn't it? It's over 200 words. It's divided into paragraphs. It's detailed. It's well organised. And the candidate has communicated clearly, but perhaps with a few lapses, as I say, perhaps related to the tenses. Certainly evidence of description and opinions. Now, the work was generally coherent, but could be considered somewhat pedestrian, not least because there was evidence of some repetition of vocabulary and structures. And the paragraphs were linked reasonably well, although there was a bit of a tendency to jump from one topic to the other. So that seems to fit quite neatly into the 10 to 12 category. And in fact, the candidate was awarded 11. So well done, I think, the one person who actually voted for 11 on that. I think a mark lower than that would have been a bit harsh, because that would have implied quite a degree of ambiguity, perhaps, or irrelevance, which isn't there. Okay, so I hope that makes sense as to why the mark of 11 was awarded for communication and content. Moving on to knowledge and application of language. Now, here the candidate has handled the basic language quite confidently, and we're certainly beginning to use more complex structures. And I see that a lot of you recognise that by voting for 7 or 8. So the complex structures here include a variety of tenses. There are negatives, subordination, comparatives, pour with the infinitive, si clauses. So it's clearly in the 7 to 8 category, but it was actually awarded 7, and I think this is partly because the vocabulary was fairly standard. There weren't many examples of words that were in that the foundation list, which you find in the specification. However, the vocabulary was pretty relevant, and so that it means that the mark shouldn't be less than 7. Now, for accuracy, most people have voted for 3 or 4. In fact, this was given 3 because there was some inconsistency in genders and verb forms. Agreements and verbs are the crucial issue, aren't they? But clearly the work is more accurate than inaccurate, so anything less than 3 would be quite wrong. The language errors didn't really hinder the communication too much. Interestingly, I noted the use of accents was a bit haphazard, and I'm sure we've all had students like that who aren't really clear what they're doing with accents. Anyway, that just to sum up, the 3 marks then of 11, 7 and 3, that totals 21. So again, going back to the grade, if the candidate had done 2 bits of work like that, would have got 42, 21 times 2, and that is just shy of an A grade. So very comfortable B, just on the borderline. I mean, it's quite possible that this candidate did a better piece of work as the second task. I don't know. I haven't retained that, so I can't tell you what the candidate actually got. But in principle, that's just short of a grade A. Now, before we move on to the next activity, I've had a question which says, I would like to know where to find marks to grades boundaries on the website. Now then, to the best of my knowledge, what you do is you look for the examiner's reports of the year that you're looking for, and they're usually printed in the back of that. So go to the website, look up the French examiner's report for this unit, and hopefully at the back of the examiner's report is the mark to grade boundaries. If it's not, then I apologise now, but perhaps you could, if you can send a question on the Ask the Expert system, then that should come to me, and then I can do some proper research and get you the correct answer if that is not right. Okay, 1 or 2 more comments coming up. Right, okay, one comment is to do with the quantity of lapses. Well, I think it's true there are lapses, and I acknowledge that. But I think what we're trying to do, as I said before, is look for what fits all those descriptors. We've got within the 10 to 12 box. There are 1, 2, 3. There are 6 bullet points, and it does seem to fit most of those quite comfortably. So lapses is just one aspect of it. There's another question, which I think is to do with the centre zone marks. I'm afraid I can't really answer that. I apologise for that because it's related to your own centre. So sorry. Okay, I think we can move on now. So I think we're in time for activity 4, which is, or should be, another script. So I think with this one I won't make any comment at all, but just let you make a start. So if you could award marks for this script, that would be great. Thank you. Okay, thank you very much for voting for that, and congratulations too on the accuracy of your marking, because certainly the majority of people are there or thereabouts. Quite a nice task, isn't it? And the candidate has done very well. For communication content, this is what one can say. There are over 200 words of French, so that's fine. It's divided up sensibly into paragraphs, very detailed, relevant, well ordered. There's no ambiguity, evidence of description, opinions and expansion. The work was coherent, well linked, and it came into that category of being pleasant to read because the candidate was beginning to write with fluency, with their own ideas and thoughts expressed in an interesting way. However, some of the opinions were a little bit basic, and that might be something to do with the topic, and that's an issue that you might like to consider when setting tasks as to how the more basic tasks sometimes lead to more basic opinions and that kind of thing. So perhaps with a more complex topic, the candidate might have had more opportunity to develop more intricate ideas. So the mark for that was 13, which is what most people put. Well done. And the knowledge and application mark. Now, here again, good mark, of course, because the basic language is handled very confident, but so is the more complex language, isn't it? The more complex structures included, and there's a whole list here. Variety of tenses, negatives, superlatives, object pronouns, bien que, adverbial phrases, infinitive clauses, and so on. So remember what I said earlier about the range being really important. The vocabulary was always relevant, and it was quite varied and reasonably complex as well. So this candidate was awarded 9 for knowledge and application of language. And again, most of you have put that, the majority have put 9. Now for accuracy, it's important to note that to get 5 for accuracy, it doesn't need to be completely faultless. And there is the odd slip in this book, isn't there? But the slips, like the word example, for example, was written in English, doesn't really hinder communication at all, does it? And as I mentioned earlier, I think the fact that the subjunctive went wrong after bien que, we really can't penalise that because it's beyond the range of the GCSE. So the overall mark then, 1395, that adds up to 27. 2 of those, that would be 54, so a very, very comfortable A star for this candidate. And the A star is at 48 out of 60. And this candidate would have got 54 with 2 pieces of work like that. Okay, now then, I've got a number of questions which I'll try and deal with before we pass on to the penultimate task. Right. Right, we're looking at the results of the vote. I'm not sure if you can do, hopefully you can see the voting results by now, but if not, perhaps that can happen in a minute. Yeah, good, I think you can now. Okay, thank you. Now the question is the stimulus restrict response a candidate is penalised? No, not as such, no, but I think it's just something to bear in mind when you are setting the task, though, that if you set a task, and particularly if the bullet points are very, very simple, then it doesn't give the candidates opportunity to fly, really. This is where the setting of the task is quite crucial. So, no, it's a positive mark scheme. So the candidates aren't penalised in any way. you know, the examiner simply marks what's there. But if the task itself is a bit dull, then maybe what could happen is that the result might be perhaps pedestrian, and it's less easy for a candidate to come up with something in that really high category where they're conveying their own thoughts with fluency. And another question. Okay, it's a comment on the first one, which is commenting about the difference between two scripts, saying that the tasks 1 and 3, you know, one was a D and one was an A, wasn't? No, it nearly got an A, I think. One was a D and one was a B. Yeah, I think what I tell the examiners is that they mustn't compare scripts. I think all you have to do is, when you're marking a script, is you have to go by what's in front of you and by the criteria, and you just mark it according to that. And you know, people can get to the same mark by very different means, and equally two different scripts might get quite a wide difference in marks, even though apparently if you know, looked at just you know, at first sight, that it looks as though they might be quite similar. So it's not always a good policy to compare scripts, and it's certainly not something that the examiners don't do. They just treat each case on its merits. More questions? Let's have a look. To what extent does the... Oh, it's disappeared, sorry. To what extent does the simple future tense... Can't read the rest of it, I'm afraid. Yes, well, it counts as a tense. I'm guessing what the question is. To what extent does the simple future tense count as a tense? Yes, it certainly does. It's not a problem. It's a clear marker of time, isn't it? So there's no issue with that. Right. Okay, well, I've had a question about the changes in the grade boundaries, and again, I'm afraid there's nothing I can comment on in this particular meeting. But I think if you'd like to go to that email address that I gave you at the start, teachinglanguages@pearson.com, then the Edexcel staff will be able to help you with that. All I would say is that it was a result of the usual procedures which were, you know, applied in, as they are every year. Edexcel is, you know, adopts the code of conduct which Ofqual demands, and we follow the procedures absolutely rigorously. So sorry if I can't say any more on that, but please go to Edexcel if you want any further, if you want to express your opinion about that or any further details about it. Okay, I think time to move on. The time's getting on, so I think we're on our last script to look at. So I think this is activity 5, please. Now this was quite an interesting one. It's I mentioned earlier that we're looking for a best fit here, and sometimes the best fit isn't immediately obvious, as you will see when you read this script. But I would also mention what I said 2 minutes ago, and that is a positive mark scheme. So we do try and reward what the candidate has done. So when you see this script, you see it's quite short. It's actually just over 80 words of French. But I won't say more on that. I'll just leave you a few minutes to award your marks for online activity 5. Right, I'm looking at the clock here, and so I think we need to draw this activity to a close fairly soon. Very interesting one to mark, quite an unusual script, as you can imagine, because quite often a poor script is characterized by poor language, or a short script is characterized by poor language. This is unusual in that it clearly the language isn't bad. So it's just over 80 words. So you could start by looking at the communication and content grid and thinking, okay, so if it's supposed to be 100 words to be minimal, that rules out 4 to 6. It's got to be 1 to 3. Alright, so if you go down that road, let's have a look at 1 to 3 and see what is relevant, what is appropriate there. Now for 1 to 3, little relevant information. Well, that's not true. Much ambiguity, that's not true. Level of response very limited, that's not true. Substantial degree of irrelevance, that's not true. And would not be comprehensible to a native speaker, that's not true either. So there's no way you could award it 1 to 3 because none of the descriptors is true. And that's what makes this interesting. So let's go in the other direction, because one or two of you have looked a little bit higher. Now if it's going to be 7 or above, that does say provides evidence of ability to go beyond a minimal response. Now that's clearly a long way from the truth. It's talked about linking piece into a whole. Well, there's not enough to link, is there really? So it doesn't really fit in the 7 to 9. So 4 to 6, there are some things here which seem to work. Alright, the level of response is minimal, isn't true, but it's comprehensible, a bit of ambiguity, relevant key information. There's enough there, and in fact it was awarded 5 for communication and content. So quite an interesting one to explore. I noticed one of the questions I had was, what was the task? Well, the only task that was given was that title, Mes Vacances. So that no other task was given, no bullet points or anything like that. And maybe that would have helped the candidate had there been some bullet points, because presumably he or she just ran out of ideas and ran out of steam after 80 words, and that was it. Whereas perhaps with some bullet points they might have continued a little bit. Now clearly we have to take into account the length in the other marks as well, because it limits itself, doesn't it? So limited language seems to be the order of the day. So for knowledge and application of language, it's going to be in the 3 to 4 area. It's in fact awarded 4 because there's beginning of a variety of tenses, but there's simply no more evidence than what's there, just that 80 words, so you can't give it any more than 4. Accuracy, well, it's certainly more correct than incorrect. You couldn't give it any more than 3, but 3 does seem to be the right mark. So unusual kind of profile for this one, but an interesting one perhaps for you to see. If only if it means that you encourage your students to write 100 words at least. The candidate then got 5, 4 and 3, so that's 12, which doubled up makes a grade E. So quite an interesting case. As I say, I'm looking a little bit at the clock here, so I'll try and do these last few questions and see if we've got time for the last activity then. One delegate has asked what the rules are about candidates who have poor writing, typing their work. Yes, the use of computers to do the work, that is permitted, but there's a bit of an issue in that they're not allowed to use the spell check, so that has to be disabled. So there might be a bit of a practical issue in your centre, but if you can resolve that one, then the candidates are allowed to word process their work. And certainly if they've got very, very poor handwriting that could obstruct communication, then that's certainly something to think about, isn't it? And if their writing is very, very poor, such that they have perhaps a special educational need or whatever, you might think about going down the special consideration route, which you can discuss in your centre. Okay, now they're moving on. Okay, sorry, I'm just having a bit of a technical problem here. Does poor handwriting have an impact on marking? Are the scripts marked online? No, they're marked live. In fact, we don't do this paper online. Yeah, I mean, the handwriting does have an effect. If candidates don't make letters clear, or they put accents in or the wrong sort of place, or just randomly or whatever, that will have an impact. Yeah, so it is important for them to write as neatly as possible. That is quite clear. But there's no mark, there's no separate mark for handwriting or anything like that, but it clearly can affect the communication mark. Okay, I've got another question here. I'm sorry I'm taking my time over these questions, but it's very hard for me to see them. Oh yes, the student for online activity 5, that's the one we've just looked at, has used English and French on the CA4 form. Is that permitted? Yes, it is. It's certainly not recommended, but it is permitted if that's what they want to do. Right, another question. Is it possible for the task to be you are writing a blog? Yep, certainly is. I think the only thing is when setting the task is to make sure that there is scope for linking. And I think where in the task I mentioned earlier, the brochure thing, there is a danger if you do an old style sort of coursework kind of brochure, is that you're writing lots of individual bits and pieces which have got no relationship with each other. So long as the blog is some kind of coherent whole, another such task would be an interview, and sometimes that works so long as the questions evolve from whatever the person has just said, and not just a load of random questions. I hope I'm trying to speak quickly, so I hope I'm making myself clear. So in other words, a lot of random questions isn't as good as one where the question evolves from the previous answer. So in other words, it's more like a proper conversation. Then you can see that there's some evidence of linking. Okay, now then, this question says, can you give a mark in a higher bracket for knowledge and application or accuracy than you did on content? It is possible, and I suppose it might happen where, for example, it was a short task, and so the mark for communication and content is restricted, but the language is very, very sophisticated. So it doesn't often happen, because candidates who know lots of sophisticated and language that they can use accurately tend not to write short pieces of work. But it is entirely possible. There are no sort of caps on that. The only cap is the one that I mentioned, to do the accuracy mark not exceeding 3 in cases where the language is just basic. Right. I think, now then, time is getting on. I think in an ideal world we would have done one more activity, which is to do with writing tasks. But perhaps if I just explain what the task is and leave you to do it in your own time. So perhaps if we can have a quick look at task 6. Thank you. Basically, there are 3 tasks there, which are ones which examiners have come across, or perhaps which I've seen on Ask the Expert or something. And what I would have done, had we had the time, is to ask you to examine them, think of what is good about those tasks and what could be perhaps even better. And certainly with a couple of the tasks, they're a bit on the long side. The recommendation is 4 to 6 bullet points. The reason being that if you have fewer than that, then it's not much use, and the candidate doesn't get a lot of guidance. If you have more than that, then what candidates tend to do is, even though it says you could do some of these things, is that a lot of them do all of them, and you end up with this problem with linking again, that you're just bobbing from one point to the next without any coherence, and so the overall piece of work then is lacking linking. So the best sort of controlled writing tasks are phrased in such a way that the candidate can link the paragraphs in some way or another. The other thing I would add to probably all three of these tasks is some phrase about the length. Yes, the final task actually does that. Anyway, I see that we are really running out of time, so I do hope that you've enjoyed the session and got some of your questions answered, if not all of them. There are opportunities, I think, to feedback, and I hope you will do that. This is my first online session, so I'd be very glad to hear from you if there's anything I can do better for the next one. And as I say, if there are any other questions, then there's the email address I mentioned, and there's also Ask the Expert, which you might like to use. And generally speaking, the French writing questions get sent to me, so I'll be able to respond to you more fully there. So thank you very much indeed for your attention, and I do hope you found it useful, and I'll hand over now to our host. Thank you.